Chapter 22 Genesis Rebooted. I'm against imposing any ideology on young children because they're not capable of critical thinking. Nevertheless, children will ask those amazing questions like, where did the world come from? And where was I before I was born? And where do people go when they die? Here in the West, unless you raise your child by turning your home into his prison, he's likely going to be conditioned by the Christian myths that permeate our culture. The child will be exposed to them through television programs, youth clubs, schools, and other outlets. These myths retain some value when they are viewed as man's attempt to reach out to God, rather than the revelation of God to man. However, Bible mythology is noticeably outdated in light of modern science. I want to outline an alternative myth that takes our discoveries into account, one that starts with the familiar word God, but goes in a new direction, a meaningful story that doesn't insult the intelligence or get bogged down in all the technicalities that have plagued this book. I don't recommend reading the following myth verbatim to young children, because some of the words will be unfamiliar and confusing. I struggle to find a child-friendly vocabulary when writing this. Nevertheless, you may be able to extract something valuable from the narrative to help you give meaningful answers to your children. Adults who resonate with monism but struggle to wrap their minds around it might find this more helpful than some of the more intellectual chapters already digested. Note that what follows is merely myth, and it relies heavily on anthropomorphism, describing the infinite as if it's human-like. I've resisted using the word God throughout much of this book, and now I'm going to wholeheartedly break that rule. But a little metaphor never hurts, except when you don't recognize it as metaphor. This approach may help you bridge the gap between the familiarity of monotheism and the strangeness of monism. Unlike Genesis chapter 1, the following myth is compatible with modern science, providing a better basis for understanding the universe than ancient Hebrew scripture. There was no beginning. There was always God. He was all-powerful, but that didn't mean anything because there was nothing for him to have power over. He was all-knowing, but there wasn't anything for him to know about except himself. He was all-seeing, but he felt completely blind because there was nothing to see. His presence was everywhere, but everywhere was nowhere because nothing else existed except him. Although God was the supreme being, residing in the blinding glory of his eternal existence, this was meaningless because there was no one and nothing below or above him. He felt as small as an unborn baby asleep in its mother's womb. His life was utterly lifeless. So he thought, I will create. But there was a snag. He didn't have any material to work with. He didn't even have any space to put anything. All that existed was God, so anything he made would be himself. He tried creating something, but it was impossible, because it could not be separated from the light of his own presence. Then he thought of a neat trick. He did something that was not quite an act of creation, but a pulling back of his own being, forming a bubble of absence. As a test, he pushed his presence into one side of the bubble to see what absence felt like. It didn't feel like anything. There was nothing to see, just like before. While continuing to gaze into the bubble, he decided to peer into the opposite side at the same time. Suddenly a face appeared, as if out of nowhere. "Who are you?" God cried out. The shape responded, "Me? And just who are you?" God pulled back in alarm. Looking across the bubble, he hadn't been able to recognize himself. The experience was terrifying and exhilarating and immensely interesting. In an existence that consisted of nothing but himself, he couldn't imagine anything more interesting, except perhaps doing the same thing on a much larger scale. So that's just what he did. God threw his presence into the bubble with reckless abandon, and the more of himself he inserted, the larger the bubble grew. The effect was like a massive explosion. He saw himself in all of the individual pieces, but none of the bits realized that they were him. Some fragments fought each other and destroyed themselves, yet this destruction was also a transformation into something new. Those fragments that got along were especially interesting because they started forming strange and fascinating relationships. Eventually, this settled down into planets that orbited around stars, which arranged themselves into galaxies. This stability was always under threat by the sheer diversity of all the things that now existed. Sometimes a huge chunk of rock would collide with a planet and cause massive damage. Occasionally, a star would become so heavy that it would collapse in on itself and start pulling in anything that got too close. The universe was a fencing match between order and chaos, with neither side ever able to win outright. Even more interesting events started happening on the surfaces of some of the planets. Tiny cells worked together, established a rapport with their environment, and eventually built themselves into creatures. Their lives were just as chaotic as the rest of the universe. They discovered they had to eat other living things just to stay alive. All sorts of variety emerged, some creatures learning to collaborate with other species, while others opted for a more isolated and aggressive approach. Those whose bodies were structured in a manner that gave them an advantage in fighting or defense got to survive, while the weaker forms died and were never seen again. Even this only made the situation more interesting, because over time the creatures took on more complex and amazing shapes. One of these was humankind. As God watched the lives of the humans, he saw them loving and hating and creating all sorts of drama. He knew that every one of them was himself, but he didn't tell them the big secret. The whole game had depended on this pretense from the beginning. But these creatures were persistent. Some of them figured out the truth just a little bit, and they would try to talk to God as if he were a separate person from them. Others attempted to reach him using meditation techniques or mind-altering substances. But who or what do you expect to find? God felt like asking them. I am you. And if I wasn't down there having these wonderful experiences as you, I would be all alone forever in a great big nowhere. Don't you get it? There's nothing up here with me. You're what makes me truly alive. So stop trying to find me. You are me. I put you down there so that I could live. Some, in their quest to find God, got hung up on mystical experiences and spent their lives pursuing those, not realizing that the whole point of living was to have a life. Some spent so much time contemplating another plane of existence that they spoiled life by neglecting to live it fully. Human lives were not built to last, and people were sometimes glum about that. They felt that they should go on living forever. This was an understandable feeling, since they were God in disguise. Some humans overcame this sadness by making up stories about going to a better place when they died. Others saw themselves as jumping into a new body when their present life was over. But the really smart ones understood that they were inside every body at the same time, only the experience of unity was walled off, except in those occasional weird moments when one of them could tell what another was thinking, or when they made something happen that wasn't ordinarily supposed to be possible. They were God in disguise, playing a game of separateness. They realized that they didn't have to worry about their little life winking out. It was just like forgetting one experience to make room for new ones. After all, they were everybody all at once. Just like bodies, God didn't make the universe to last. Eventually he will pull all the separate parts of himself together again, and there will only be him alone, as it was before. And that situation will be as uninteresting as it always was. So he will play the game again. He always has, and he always will.